Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be talking about IQ testing today. You sent over some really interesting excerpts from this book, The IQ Mythology, and it looks like it's going to be an interesting discussion about, how IQ testing kind of intersects with things like race and class and equality.
Yeah, it really digs into the history of IQ tests. And it makes a pretty bold argument like that these tests, far from being objective measures of intelligence, they may have actually served to justify, these pre-existing social hierarchies.
Wow. Okay, so where do we even begin with a claim like that? Where does the book even start?
Well, it starts with a pretty shocking historical fact. Before IQ tests, as we know them today, back in the 19th century, the go-to method for assessing intelligence was actually something called craniometry.
Craniometry. What is that? Is that like phrenology? Like measuring the bumps on people's heads?
Yeah. Well, not bumps, but skull sizes.
Yeah.
They were literally measuring skulls to try and prove that, certain races and classes were more intelligent than others. And it gets even crazier. Even leading scientists at the time were endorsing this.
Wow. So judging intelligence by hat size, basically. It's not, I guess, not surprising that this kind of thinking was used to justify some pretty awful things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this early pseudoscience, I think, really reveals the danger of trying to link physical traits to these complex mental abilities.
So how do we get from measuring skulls to the IQ tests that we're all kind of more familiar with today? Like, how did that transition happen?
Well, the book takes us to the early 20th century, and then we have the introduction of the Binet test. The interesting thing is that the original purpose of this test was actually pretty well intentioned.
Yeah.
It was designed to identify children who were struggling in school so that they could get extra help.
That makes sense, yeah. Kind of like a diagnostic tool, not like a ranking system.
Right. But then the book reveals how figures like Henry Goddard, a psychologist in the U.S., he started using this on immigrants at Ellis Island.
Ellis Island, that's where, millions of immigrants were coming into America. What happened there?
Yeah. He used the Binet test to declare a large number of immigrants feeble-minded, people from Russia, Jewish immigrants, Hungarians, Italians. He claimed that they were intellectually inferior.
And then, of course, this scientific data was then used to justify limiting immigration from those countries.
Exactly. And the book draws a direct line from this biased use of the Binet test to the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely restricted immigration, from Southern and Eastern Europe.
So we're already seeing how a test, designed with a seemingly good purpose can be manipulated to kind of reinforce pre-existing prejudices. It's kind of disturbing how that can happen.
Yeah, it gets even more complicated. During World War I, the U.S. Army began using intelligence tests on a massive scale. Millions of recruits were given these tests.
And I'm guessing those results were used to stereotype certain groups as well.
You're absolutely right. The Army test results were used to argue, yet again, for the intellectual inferiority of Black and immigrant recruits. And this data really contributed to the growing popularity of the eugenics movement.
Oh, eugenics. The idea that you can, improve the human race through selective breeding.
Yeah.
That's pretty chilling stuff. So by this point, the idea that intelligence was fixed, some groups are just born smarter. This idea was becoming really ingrained in society, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's one of the key takeaways here. And the book kind of challenges this idea of fixed intelligence by highlighting the age-old nature-nurture debate.
Nature versus nurture. Are we born with a certain level of intelligence, or is it shaped by our environment and our experiences? I imagine the book has a lot to say about that.
It does. And what's fascinating is that both sides of the debate, those who believe in innate intelligence and those who emphasize the role of environment, they sometimes end up kind of supporting these existing inequalities.
How can both sides of the debate kind of reinforce those inequalities?
Well, take the example of Carl Brigham, the psychologist who developed those Army intelligence tests that we were just talking about. He initially used those results to promote, racist views. But then he later admitted that the tests had major flaws.
So even someone who was using those tests to support those prejudiced ideas came to question their validity. Did he completely abandon those beliefs, though?
Well, he did acknowledge that cultural and linguistic differences affected how people scored on those tests, but instead of rejecting IQ tests altogether, he actually proposed creating new tests that he thought could better account for those differences.
So he was still trying to refine the tool rather than get rid of it? But wouldn't that still be problematic, trying to measure something as complex as intelligence through these standardized tests?
That's the big question the book is raising. Are we just going to keep trying to measure intelligence in ways that just inevitably lead to bias?
Okay. This is where things start to get really interesting. We were just talking about Carl Brigham and how he wanted to develop like less biased IQ tests. But the book also talks about Horace Mann Bond, who had a very different approach.
Yeah, Horace Mann Bond was an African-American scholar, and he really pushed back against those racist interpretations of IQ tests that were so common back then. He looked at how environmental factors played a role, especially when it came to education.
So instead of just accepting that, some racial groups were just less intelligent, he was looking at the context of where these tests were being given.
Right, like he compared black students in the North and the South and how they did on these tests.
And what did you find?
He found that black students in the North were consistently scoring higher than those in the South, even though obviously they're still dealing with, unequal conditions up north.
So that seems to suggest that even within a racially segregated society, opportunity and access to education had a huge impact.
Absolutely. And Bond argued that the differences in scores were directly related to things like, school funding, how good the education was that was available to black students in different parts of the country.
So he was basically showing that environment played a much bigger role than these tests were giving credit for.
Yeah, exactly. Bond's research really challenged that idea that intelligence is fixed, and it exposed how these social conditions had a big influence on how people performed on these tests.
It's like they were saying, see, the tests prove that certain groups are less intelligent, but ignoring all the systemic inequalities that were affecting the results in the first place.
Exactly. And the book really gets into, the idea that even though people try to make them more objective, IQ tests just are inherently biased. There are even like specific examples of test items that were clearly skewed towards certain cultural backgrounds.
Okay, so what kind of biased test items are we talking about here? What are some examples?
Well, some questions would require you to know about, symphony orchestras or certain literary works, things that people from certain socioeconomic backgrounds would be more likely to know because they had more access to those cultural experiences.
So even if you're super bright, if you haven't been exposed to those specific things, you're just automatically at a disadvantage.
Exactly. And then there were other test items that just straight up had like really obvious stereotypes about different racial groups and gender, which just skewed the results even more.
That's really disturbing. Like it's almost like the tests were designed to uphold existing power structures instead of actually measuring intelligence fairly.
Yeah. And then these problematic tests were used to track students into different educational paths, which again just reinforced the class and racial divisions that were already there.
Can you give an example of how this tracking played out in real life?
Yeah. The book talks about Selma, Alabama. Even after schools were officially desegregated, they still used IQ tests to separate black and white students into different classes.
So even though they were in the same building, they were still being segregated based on these test scores.
Right. And the book argues that this tracking, which they justified with IQ scores, it it became like a sneaky form of segregation. It really limited opportunities for students from, marginalized backgrounds.
It's like this pattern we keep seeing over and over again, using the idea of intelligence to control people and keep them separate instead of, helping them reach their full potential.
That's a great point. And a lot of times this segregation came in the form of something called minimum competency testing.
Minimum competency testing. That was supposed to be about raising educational standards, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that the idea?
Well, yeah, on the surface. But critics argued that instead of making education better for everyone, it usually just ended up narrowing the curriculum, especially for certain groups of students. They focused on really basic skills, what the book calls the curriculum of despair.
It's sad to think that instead of nurturing each child's potential, we created a system that limited their possibilities based on these flawed tests.
It is. And it all ties back into that deficit model that we talked about before, the idea that some groups are just inherently lacking in intelligence.
So if a child wasn't doing well in this limited system, they were labeled as deficient instead of questioning the system itself.
Pretty much. And there's this great story in the book about a teacher named Herbert Cole who just completely rejected that whole deficit model.
Oh, tell me about Herbert Cole.
He was a teacher in Harlem, and he was really disturbed by how they were using IQ tests to label his students. So he decided to just, throw out those test scores. He wanted to create a classroom where kids could actually learn and explore and love learning.
So what happened when he got rid of that deficit model?
His students, who had been labeled as low achievers because of their IQ scores, they thrived. They did so well in a learning environment where they were encouraged to think for themselves and be creative.
That's amazing. It really shows how much potential gets wasted when we rely on these narrow definitions of intelligence and don't see the unique gifts that each kid has.
For sure. It's a powerful example of what can happen when we focus on nurturing intelligence instead of just trying to measure it.
This whole conversation has really got me thinking about the bigger picture. It's not just about the tests themselves, it's about how we've used and misused this idea of intelligence throughout history.
You're hitting on a really important point, and the book takes this conversation to a global level, looking at how IQ tests were used to justify colonialism.
Wow. That adds a whole other layer to this. What happened when they started using these tests in colonial contexts?
Well, you had Western psychologists going into these colonized countries and giving people their IQ tests. And surprise, surprise, a lot of times the results showed that the people in these colonized places scored lower than the Europeans.
And then they used those results to say, see, we're smarter than them. We're supposed to be in charge.
Exactly. It was a way to justify their power and control. And the book points out that these tests just completely ignored the huge cultural and linguistic differences in all these societies.
It's like using a tool that was made for one specific purpose to measure something totally different.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The book says that every culture has its own ways of thinking and solving problems. To just impose a Western test on them is unfair and it doesn't tell the whole story.
Just another example of how they twisted the idea of intelligence to maintain power.
It really is. And that makes you wonder if these IQ tests are so problematic, are they even useful at all?
So before we were talking about how IQ tests have been used to justify some pretty messed up things throughout history. Where do we even go from here? Like if these traditional tests are so problematic, are there other ways to even try to understand and measure intelligence?
Well, the book actually explores some really interesting alternative approaches. Like one area that's getting a lot of attention is something called dynamic assessment.
Dynamic assessment. That sounds pretty different from the usual, like, sit down paper and pencil tests that we're all kind of used to.
Yeah, it is. The idea with dynamic assessment is to look at a person's the potential to learn rather than just what they already know at this moment in time.
So it's more about how someone learns and how they solve problems, not just, if they can memorize a bunch of facts or answer, tricky questions.
Exactly. Instead of just measuring like a fixed level of intelligence, it actually looks at how someone's thinking skills can, evolve and grow over time.
I can see how that would be a much more like helpful and empowering approach, especially for learners who maybe, don't do so well in those traditional testing environments.
Yeah. And these dynamic assessments often involve like, interactive tasks and feedback loops. So it's not just about getting the right answer, but it's about understanding how they got to that answer. How do they respond to new information?
That makes a lot of sense. It's a much more like well-rounded way of looking at intelligence. The book also mentioned the idea of emotional intelligence, EQ.
Yeah.
Is that another area where we're seeing a shift in how we think about intelligence?
Absolutely. EQ it's being recognized as a vital part of human capability.
Hmm.
And it includes things like self-awareness, empathy, the ability to manage your emotions and understand the emotions of other people. And those are really important for navigating life and building, healthy relationships.
Yeah. It seems like, it seems kind of obvious that being smart isn't just about having a high IQ. You can be brilliant in that kind of academic sense, but still really struggle with social interactions or not know how to manage your emotions in a healthy way.
Right. And research has shown that people with high EQ tend to be more successful in a lot of areas of life, like their careers and their relationships.
So why has there been such a big emphasis on IQ for so long if this emotional intelligence is so important too?
Well, it goes back to those historical biases
Yeah.
that we've been talking about. The traditional way of looking at intelligence, the way they measured it with IQ tests, it's always, privileged these cognitive abilities over things like emotional awareness or social skills.
So how do we even start to measure EQ in a way that's, actually meaningful?
Well, there are a lot of different assessment tools that they're developing, but it's still a pretty new field, especially compared to traditional intelligence testing.
I imagine it must be a lot harder to to measure something like empathy or self-awareness than, to test someone's vocabulary or something.
Yeah, for sure. It comes with its own unique challenges.
Yeah.
But researchers are definitely making progress in developing ways to assess these more subtle aspects of human intelligence.
It's fascinating to think that we're really expanding our understanding of what it means to be intelligent. It's not just about, logic and reasoning, but also about our emotions and our capacity to connect with others.
Exactly. And speaking of expanding our understanding of intelligence, the book brings up some really interesting questions about, you know, artificial intelligence, AI. Where does that fit in?
Oh, wow. That's where it gets really interesting. As AI becomes more and more advanced, are we going to have to completely redefine what it means to be intelligent?
Yeah, it's a question we can't ignore. I mean, AI is already doing things that we used to think were, only humans could do, like complex calculations, data analysis, even creative stuff like writing music or creating art.
So how do we even distinguish human intelligence from artificial intelligence? Are there areas where humans still have the edge?
Well, for now, humans definitely still have an advantage when it comes to, critical thinking, empathy, moral reasoning.
Mhm.
Those are areas where AI is still catching up.
So maybe the future of intelligence testing is going to involve figuring out how to measure those distinctly human qualities, the things that really set us apart from machines.
That's a real possibility. As
Wow.
AI keeps evolving, we might need to develop, whole new kinds of assessments that actually focus on those aspects of intelligence that are uniquely human, like our ability to understand complex emotions, navigate ethical dilemmas, and to think creatively in ways that AI just can't.
This whole deep dive has been such a mind-blowing experience. I'm seeing IQ tests and the whole concept of intelligence so differently now.
It's amazing how looking back at the history of something can really help us understand the present and even, imagine different possibilities for the future.
I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time.
And as the book suggests, maybe the most important question to ask ourselves is if traditional IQ tests don't really measure intelligence, then what does it even mean to be intelligent?
That's a question worth thinking about for sure. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the world of IQ testing and the ever-evolving nature of intelligence. Until next time, keep those minds curious.